Hello, and thank you for joining today's Focusing Attention on the Real Risks, Perception and Potential. My name is Holly, and I'm part of the professional development team here at IIRSM. Your speaker today is Dr. Ruth Murray. Before I hand over to Ruth, I'm just going to do a few things first. So to begin with, you should see to the right of your screen a control panel. Use the red arrow to open the panel. You'll be on mute for the duration of the webinar, but you can choose how you listen to the computer audio or phone call by selecting the appropriate option in the audio settings. Feel free to ask any questions using the questions area, and we will respond to these at the end of Ruth's. And finally, the webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be placed on the IIRSM YouTube channel after the event. Okay, that's enough from me. Ruth, I'm now going to hand over to you and make you the presenter now.
Thank you very much, Holly. Just swap over here. Excellent. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for the opportunity for me to share with you in this webinar. I'm actually just going to turn off my webcam whilst I'm speaking, and then I'll put that back on for questions and answers later. Just doing that and going into presenter mode. Okay, so a little bit about me first. My work and interests span change and risk, and for me they're clearly linked. Change is risky, and to deal with risk more effectively, most organisations, certainly the ones that I've come across around the world, need to change. I've worked on a number of risk culture transformations. I've advised boards and senior teams of many companies of all sizes and in all sectors. There are some examples on the slide there. And large chunks of my career have been spent in chemicals, where I started my career, in nuclear pharmaceuticals, in oil and gas, and in shipping. So I'm well versed in the challenges of developing an appropriate culture to keep people safe, alongside a culture where risks are taken to create strategic value. And I've also written some books, which you can, there are some links later that you can have a look at. Just to say, the images in this presentation were drawn by a lady called Vanessa Randall, and the copyright for those images is Vanessa's. So there are three areas I'd like to cover. I'm going to make this interactive throughout, so we're going to be using the polling capabilities of GoToWebinar, and I'll also leave plenty of time at the end for your questions. So let's just start with a couple of questions now. So Holly, if we could just start the polls really and find out first of all where you are in the world. If you could select one of those. I think from some of you have linked in with me, so I know that there are people from different continents. Okay, so mainly in Europe, but 20% in Asia and 7% in Africa. So that's great. Welcome to you all. And then just another quick question. What's your primary focus or interest in risk management? Maybe I should have had all of the above as one of the options. But if it's all of them, choose enterprise risk management. Okay, how are we doing there? Okay, fine, right. So that's good to know. So there are about a third of you who've maybe got a broad organisational perspective on this, but many of you looking specifically at health and safety, and some of you at environment. So that's good to know. Okay. Now, so the first point that I want to to make is around this idea that risk, like love, is in the eye of the beholder. And why would I say that? It's a twist on a quote about love, obviously, the idea being that who we fall in love with is very much about personal taste. Different people perceive different things to others, and indeed, who are we to judge who another person loves? But just relating this to risk management actually can result in our risk management efforts being a little bit all over the place, like the image there drawn by Vanessa. And of course, we really don't want our organisations, we really don't want our judgments about risk to be like this. We want to be able to describe, assess and respond to risk in a consistent and rational manner. Indeed, I'm sure that many of us would put forward, just our very profession of risk management has been a rational subject. And lots of the writing about risk management is technical. Statistics are necessary to look at things probabilistically. There are a multitude of guides and standards and methods that help us make the task of understanding risk and making good decisions in the light of risk as rational as possible. But in the final analysis, risk management is about people who all perceive things differently and who are trying to predict the future with their flawed and biased crystal ball. So, is this all a waste of time? Well, no, of course not. Let me just move on my slide here. Organisations have a responsibility to their shareholders and wider stakeholders to anticipate the future and to invest to create as much value as it's practicable for them to create. And we know that the triple bottom line of profit, people and planet is increasingly important. Around the world, organisations that are only going after profit are increasingly under pressure and adopting much more sustainable and responsible business practices, and long may that continue. So what can we do to acknowledge and work with the fact that different people have different attitudes to risks because they perceive, they see, they hear, or they feel them differently? Well, first of all, we have to understand, and then we can manage. So in my work with David Hillson, first published in 2005, Understanding and Managing Risk Attitude at the top there, that's the second edition, 2007, we explored what we've called the triple strand of influences on perception and risk attitude. This work stands on the shoulders of giants in behavioural economics, people like Kahneman and Tversky, who taught us that we were actually not risk averse but loss averse, and in risk psychology. And there's a huge literature out there, and it's a starting point for our work on decision making in risky, important situations. So, why the triple strand? The picture is a much simplified one, but is really saying that there are three things that influence our perception of risk. When anyone's faced with any situation, they automatically make a conscious and situational assessment. Something like, have I seen anything like this before? Was my past experience good or bad? Do I judge I can directly influence the outcome? Maybe we think, how close is the impact on my objectives in time? A really important conscious and situational factor. And there is an argument that says part of the problem with the climate emergency is that the impact on our objectives isn't very close, and therefore, although there will be differences of opinion on this, but the degree to which we are in a climate emergency is softened because it's not affecting us maybe today, whereas obviously the COVID-19 emergency has been right now, and therefore we've responded to that in a different way. So there are a whole host of conscious and situational factors that we make, and that would sort of be okay if that was it. But the second strand is that at the same time, our wonderful, clever brains are making subconscious mental shortcuts, what we would call heuristics. I'm sure lots of you are used to that word. And our brains are taking advantage of cognitive biases. There are a long list of things that have evolved to make the job of the human brain easier when faced with information. We don't process every decision from first principles every time. We rely on mental shortcuts and biases. So, for example, a subconscious assessment of, have I experienced anything like this before, could save your life if it's sensory information like hairs on the back of your neck standing up about an advancing predator, or something that's a sixth sense about maybe something that's going to go wrong. And so this stuff, can literally save our lives, or certainly give us that maybe intuition about what's going on. But unfortunately, and this is the really hard bit, what we perceive isn't always real. There's a brilliant book written by a guy called Dan Ariely. If you haven't read it, I would really recommend it. It's called Predictably Irrational. His argument is, as human beings, we are predictably irrational. So, that's something that we really need to be aware of. And another big contribution to that automatic, that subconscious assessment is also our personality. So I work closely with a tool called the Risk Type Compass. Some of you might be aware of that, and you can type that into a search engine and find out more. But it's a great way of helping understand how our inherent preferences when faced with uncertainty play out. Some of us are our personality leads us to be cautious and wary and quite prudent, and we would see others, if you're like that, you might see people who are quite adventurous and carefree about being spontaneous, being really quite they're cowboys, they can't be trusted. By the same token, people whose personality leaves them to be really open to new ideas and seeking out new things might see somebody who's very wary and cautious about being, from the business prevention department and quite a stick in the mud. So this, no one's fixed, but if we don't understand ourselves, we can get in the way of our decision making. So that's that second strand. And then the third strand, well, feelings and emotions. Scientists who study brain and behavior have shown us how those very visceral emotions play the largest part in our decision making when faced with risky and important situations. It's quite an inconvenient fact that is the largest influence on our perception. So whether that emotion is fear, or less extreme emotions that lead us away from something we don't want, or indeed if it's desire for something that we do want, these emotions are shown to be some of the most powerful influences. And without awareness and an ability to respond, not react, we chase the things that we believe will bring us more pleasure than pain. That's happening in boardrooms, it's happening in governments, and it's happening in families, it's happening everywhere else. The point of the triple strand isn't just that there are three sets of influences on our perceptions in risky and important situations, but that the three are interwoven, so that at the point of making a decision, we don't know for sure what's driving our behaviour. It's a complex mix of influences that's not easy to decipher. And of course, most of the time that's good. It allows us to free flow. It allows us to go about our day making decisions all the time and in a mainly sensible way. But sometimes when the consequence of the decision could really matter, when it's about a risk to something that really matters, then it's not good. And it gets worse for decision-making groups, because not only is everyone different, but group biases come into play too. So, we follow the leader to avoid challenge. We seek refuge in what I've called here safety in numbers to preserve relationships. Groupthink is an example of a group bias, where we prefer to have harmony in the group than to say what we're really thinking. Or we get drawn into things like risky shifts or cautious shifts. So we talk ourselves into or out of decisions collectively. Again, all decision makers, and particularly decision-making groups, need effective ways of understanding what's going on so they can make eyes-open choices. So I'd like to just ask another poll question at this point and say, in your experience, to what extent does personal perception of risks make your job more difficult? How are we doing, Holly? Okay, so that's good. What you're saying is sometimes that's a problem. People agree on most areas, but not all. But nearly 20% of you are saying it's really difficult to get any consensus at all. So I think that's good, but also just be aware that sometimes when people seem to be agreeing, it might be because it's easier to agree than to really explore the extent of what's going on. Brilliant. So that was the first thing I wanted to talk about. The second point is then moving on to some ideas about risk, about objectives, and about appetite and capacity for risk. So the triple strand can help us to help ourselves and to help decision-making groups to understand their thinking and drivers when faced with risky and important situations. But that's not enough. We also need to understand more about objectives and about the appetite and capacity for risk that exists in the organisation in relation to those objectives. Now, it's a complex area, and my work with David Hillson and beyond, working with many boards and decision-making groups in this area, is focused on trying to make concepts that are easy to describe but difficult to use. My work is really trying to make things practical to use. So if we just look at a couple of definitions for starters and then look at application. So I think most of us will be aware of definitions for risk appetite. There are a few around, but most of them are around are similar to the one in the International Standard for Risk Management, ISO 31000. So risk appetite is something about the amount and the type of risk that an organisation is prepared to pursue, retain or take. And of course it's not said in that definition, but of course it's absolutely axiomatic. It's obvious with this definition that this is the amount and type of risk related to objectives. I explain the notion of risk appetite to senior leaders using the very simple language: how much risk is too much risk when pursuing your goals? Or another way of putting that is, what is the range of tolerable variation from your objectives? And of course, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to this. So for example, the one organisational objective might be for people to go home safely every day, now, today, and in the future. Another objective might be to increase earnings for shareholders by 10% by 2025. Another objective might be to be carbon neutral by 2040. So of course, talking about the risk appetite of the organisation like it's one thing makes no sense at all. It needs to be related to those specific objectives. And so my experience is that it's best to define appetite for risk in the same units as you measure performance. Hopefully you're doing this. And then you have multiple appetites for multiple objectives. So that's the theory. So let's just look at some examples, some application. In some organisations, so in my last job, I was the director of the change portfolio and the group head of risk for the UK's largest maritime port company. In that organisation, the decision that the board and the senior leaders took was that all risks would be assessed versus objectives using financial expression, financial measures. So there, all of their qualitative metrics, so that might be, being lost time accident frequency rates, or it might be customer satisfaction. They were all translated into a financial expression of a target and a range of tolerable outcomes around that target. So all risk and the corresponding appetite for risk is measured in monetary terms. There are some, it's nice and simple at one level. There are obviously some challenges with doing that, because in doing that, you also need to make judgments about how you're going to price the human life, etc. Very difficult. And lots of organisations find that far too difficult and simplistic, and they don't do that, and they maintain a scorecard of financial and non-financial measures, each with their own risk appetite. So here's an example. You might have an expression of your appetite for risk about your health and safety objectives. You might measure that with a lagging indicator, such as lost time accident frequency rate, or maybe you measure on a leading indicator, such as number of near misses reported. But to express your appetite, you need to have a target, and you need to have a range, a tolerable variation around that target in which you're prepared to take risk. Similarly, you can do that obviously for money. That might be, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization, EBITDA. It might be free cash flow. You would measure that in a currency. It's quite interesting, even if you look at those two, A and B, because clearly with health and safety, what we're trying to do is to drive to people going home safely every day, to a level of, lots of organisations would have zero tolerance for any risk that would lead to harming people, and concepts like, as low as reasonably practicable, of course, you're all very familiar with. And so that mindset that then, we've got a really low tolerance for risk for hurting people, for killing people, you need to keep separate from the tolerable variation around your financial targets, where actually your shareholders probably want you to take risk to create value, not avoid risk. And this is one of the real problems that we have in organisations that have got very strong safety cultures, because if we're not careful, the ALARP principle is then related to everything, whereas actually one person once said to me, rather than a LARP, as low as reasonably practicable, when we're looking at creating value, we want that to be a HARP, as high as reasonably practicable. Interesting concept. But you'll get the idea here that depending on what your objectives are, then you might have very different expressions of risk appetite. So around sustainability or customer satisfaction, staff satisfaction, whatever it is that you're looking at. So the first job that needs to be done with a board or a senior team is to sort this out. We need to engage boards and senior teams, first of all, to agree objectives. You sort of hope that bit's easy and that all of your organisations have agreed their objectives. Maybe they've not agreed them at a granular enough level, though, to help the risk management process. The second thing is agreeing how performance versus those objectives will be measured, so they're SMART goals. Hopefully that's been already done. And then there's a task of agreeing the range of tolerable variation for each objective, and you know, that can take a lot of discussion and a lot of debate. And in doing that, the fourth step is that you need to then be able to check that at the worst case, the worst performance for each objective, that the organisation has the capacity to bear that loss. That's the idea of risk capacity. Now, often, you know, all the books and the guides would say that risk capacity is something that is a financial measure. You know, can your balance sheet withstand this loss? And of course, that is relevant, but you know, I would encourage you to also consider that capacity is also about reputation. You know, what is the level, and if we're thinking about triple bottom line and you know, looking at profit and planet and people, you know, what is the capacity that your organisation has to, you know, bear a loss that is about, you know, losing customer confidence because you're a polluter, or that you're seen as being a poor employer. You know, that I think reputational impacts are becoming far more important, and thinking about risk capacity in terms of reputation similarly so. So this would all be easy, but of course it's made more difficult because of the triple strand, because different senior leaders have different perceptions of how much is too much. You know, getting an easy you know, getting those 4 steps done easily with a proper debate and really reflecting what's going on can be really tricky. Yet it's really important, because decisions about to respond to risks are justified only when seen in the context of risk appetite. It's obviously irrational to spend money on reducing exposure to a threat that would not be significant if it happened. And it's irrational to just leave an opportunity to chance if an investment now could increase the chances of gaining the benefits. So that simple list, it's really hard to do because of the first point about the triple strand, but it's really important to do if the organisation is going to have a competent risk management process that invests its money and its time, its effort in the right places to achieve its objectives. So how do we do that? And that brings me to really the second question, and then to my third point. So just thinking about risk appetite in your organisation, is that expressed clearly? Does that help you know whether a risk can be tolerated or not? So what's that looking like, Holly? Good. So again, this is not a disaster. There's some good practice going on in lots of areas. It's clear where a risk can be tolerated, but yeah, we've got 20% who are feeling comfortable in this area, and 20% who are saying no, we're really all over the place here. It's difficult to know if a risk can be tolerated. So real spread. Thank you for sharing that. And hopefully, you know, you've got specific questions to ask me when we get to Q&A, which won't be long now. Okay, so 2 points already. One about risk attitude and the influence of perception on risk attitude. The second one about risk appetite. The third thing I want to talk about, and this is another area where I've published this time with Penny Pullen, is then about the role of facilitation in really helping us to move forward here. engaging people to really own and manage risk. For me, even though we need stats and we need to understand probabilistics and we need to understand methods and frameworks and lots of technical stuff, at its heart, risk management is a human endeavour. You know, we're trying to predict the future, and that's been done by people. It's absolutely fraught with pitfalls as people seek to understand and to put aside their own preferences and consider what is best for the organisation at that time. Most groups of decision makers find it too difficult to manage the process of this themselves, and they need a skilled facilitator to help them manage the process and to provide a neutral challenge. My experience is that senior teams are often perplexed that a discussion with them about risk appetite is not about risk, but is about performance, about objectives and tolerable variations. I've been to so many organisations and where I've been invited to work with boards to help them express their risk appetite, and they're surprised that I'm talking about performance, because appetite is about performance. But of course, if you work through that, then you're in a much better position to then identify, assess and manage risks. So when I talked about the real risks in the title of this webinar, I meant two things. I meant the risks that really matter to objectives, the ones that are material when considering the tolerable range of outcomes and appetite for risk. And I also meant the risks that the decision-making group concur are relevant. And that takes work to prevent outline views that are relevant being filtered out. So, you know, a little bit about how we might do that. Identification and framing of risks, risk descriptions, becomes much easier when the objectives at risk are clear. An uncertainty that would not directly impact one or more risks is obviously not a risk, you know that. Also, qualitative assessment of risks becomes much easier when you're able to discuss the triple strand of influences, where as a facilitator you're able to anticipate bias and design a process to avoid this. So what I wanted to share here are some examples, and hopefully these resonate, although you might have different things going on. So here, what I'm imagining, and this has happened to me lots, that I'm working with a group, and what I have is one or more influential stakeholders saying, well, in my experience, it'll be like this, or in my experience, this won't happen. In my experience, this will always happen. In my experience. You know, how can we deal with that, knowing that that person might be being biased by a whole host of things? They might be being biased by the representativeness, that's hard to say, the representativeness, still can't say it, won't try again, heuristic. This is about saying that we're biased by situations that we've seen before. We think that this scenario will be like one that we've seen before. So we're comparing that. And as closely linked to that, or makes it even worse, is the availability heuristic, which is saying that information that is most memorable is we see as being more important. You know, it's why you know, although we knew that there was going to be the chance of a global pandemic was very high, because we were influenced by that really not having happened to us anytime recently, certainly from a UK perspective. You know, maybe in other parts of the world where you had experienced pandemics, maybe with Ebola, or certainly if we look at Asia, and you know, readiness for respiratory pandemics because of Asian flu, etc., that those countries were better prepared. If not better prepared, knew that the chance of a global pandemic was higher. So we also those leaders may be biased by strong emotional attachment to what's going on, or maybe a manageability or an illusion of control bias. So that's a problem, and what can we do? So here are some things that I would try as a facilitator. First of all, I would find and offer perspectives from others with experience on similar things. That might mean going out and getting benchmark data, data from other organisations, telling stories about other organisations, anything that might provide into that group or to that person a different perspective. Sometimes it's really important to reframe the problem. So if something's been reframed in a negative way, express it in a positive way, just turn it around, help people to anchor to a different starting point. There's lots of literature out there around anchoring and how, particularly around Kahneman and Tversky's work, and how we present a problem is very influential in the answer that we get. So if we can turn a question round, express a risk in a different way, perhaps we can sometimes get a different view. Also, I would really recommend that you talk in ranges and not single points. If you're talking about numbers, try to express the whole area of potential outcomes, not just one outcome, and then challenge the extremes. That can be really useful. Also, it's really important not to put a single stakeholder in the spotlight and make it easy to change their minds. You know, if we back people into a corner, then people come out fighting. So, you know, change where the spotlight is looking, and make it easy for people who've maybe come out with a really strong point of view, for starters, to actually change their minds. So some ideas there that may be useful. Here's a different one. So sometimes, and I think this is really quite worrying, you know, because many of the problems that we're faced with, the potential problems or potential opportunities, the risks we're faced with, we don't really know how likely it is to occur or how big the impact would be if it did occur. But there is, you know, as we become more senior in organisations, there seems to be a thing that, well, we don't know, but we probably think we should know, and so we're more likely to guess and do a guess, but you know, claim it as gospel. We're more likely to be drawn into maybe something like the intelligence trap, which is a cognitive bias that really favours people who are linguistically intelligent. So if someone can put a good story together why something's true, then they believe it is true, and other people believe it's true, even though it could be complete nonsense. So people, if you don't know, or people actually don't know but maybe are pretending that they do, that's also a time when you've got real potential for a risky or a cautious shift within a group setting. So one person makes a statement, I think this could happen. It could be really bad, and then someone else jumps in and goes, yeah, and and what if this, what if that, so it's really bad, yeah, I've had some evidence of that. People are then piling in with their experience of why that could be true, and you either get a downward spiral, a risky shift, where a downward spiral, a cautious shift, or a risky shift where people are going, you know, this is a great opportunity. Yeah, this is really likely to happen. Let's do it. So what can we do about that? So I think, you know, all of us need to be good at drafting risk descriptions, whether in writing or presenting them verbally, in the form of a series of questions that people can really explore. So, you know, how likely do you think is that X could happen? What will be the impact if Y happens? That's standard stuff. But really, you know, changing the words, really trying to engage people with a conversation about, you know, do we have any data at all about how likely this is? You know, one of the challenges that we have, I think, with a lot of safety risks is we tend to talk about frequencies of risks rather than probabilities. So, not seen in this industry in the last 10 years. We talk about things being 1 in 100-year risks. It's really amazing how many incidents we've had of risks that are supposed to be 1 in 100 years in the last 12 months. So we, really to get a good understanding of how much we don't know. It's okay not to know. It's not okay to pretend you do know when you don't really. Another thing that I would do and increasingly do, and of course this works really well virtually, is to seek independent input from large numbers of people as input to any final analysis. So I think, often we put the spotlight on senior leaders and we expect them to know and we expect them to make good decisions, but actually getting a larger amount of input and then really challenging the outliers can work really well. And one of my other very favourite books, a book by James Surowiecki called The Wisdom of Crowds, really would highly recommend it, uses this approach. And the idea of the wisdom of crowds is that a large group of people with some knowledge are consistently more effective than single experts. Yet in our organisations, we often go to the single expert, somebody with experience, and expect them to have a good answer. And evidence, shows time and time again that that is really flawed thinking. Okay, so just a couple of things you might come across when you are working with teams to try and facilitate the risk management process. Obviously, facilitation is about making things easy for a person or a group to achieve their objectives. That's what facilitation means. It's from the Latin facile, which is to make easy. So it's about making it easy, but it's not easy to do. It's particularly challenging. The facilitator needs to be familiar with a whole range of techniques that they can sort of pull out of the air when needed, to prevent teams from becoming blinded by a large number of conscious and subconscious decision biases. And I think that there are 3 things that continue to exercise my thinking and practice when I work with clients. It's about how do we train people to be great facilitators of the risk management process. I don't apologize for saying risk management is a human process, and facilitating that human process is vital to success. But linked to that is, how do we prepare senior decision makers to ask great questions to challenge the data that they're presented with? And then how do we harness learning from experience to improve our ability to engage people to identify, own and manage risk in future? So just moving on really to get some ideas about how facilitation's working in your organisation. Is the need for expert facilitation of risk management acknowledged? How's that looking, Holly? Okay, so 23% are saying, yeah, it's facilitation, it's understood that it helps challenge bias, that's great. That's quite a large number of people then on this webinar, that their organisations are probably not getting optimal results from their risk analysis and management because there's some biased thinking going on. Certainly the middle one, I've seen that in so many people. People want a risk facilitator, they want a workshop done, they want the output, but they don't expect their facilitator to have any challenge on the people in that group. And I think that is a real problem, and it's incumbent on us risk professionals to get better at that and to save organisations from themselves and from any poor decision making. So just moving on really to my summary, and then I can take some questions. So I called this webinar Focusing Attention on the Real Risks, you know, and that real risks means we really need to get our head around this matter of perception, but also our potential to do things differently. You know, for me, risk is like love. It's in the eye of the beholder. Whether I see something as likely to happen will be very different from your perception, and that might be about my personality, it might be about my experience, it might be about you know, different biases that are coming to play. So you know, we need to just accept that our risk analysis is a matter of perception and not fact. But there are 3 areas that we can pay attention to that will help our organisations to really understand and then manage the real risks to their objectives. So the first one, recognising that the triple strand of influence exists. That's the first step, and that it skews our perceptions and leads to poor decisions. And there are a number of ways to get that understood. Obviously, I would like you to read my books, but that's not the only way. There's lots of other information that you'll be able to find on the internet, and I'm sure from IIRSM to help you, you know, understand some of that risk psychology. The second point is about defining the appetite for risk as a measurable range of performance versus strategic objectives. And again, you know, your leaders might think this is a conversation about performance and not risk. It is, but it's a vital conversation to have, so that you do know the risks that can be tolerated and the ones that can't. And then putting those things together, engaging decision makers, whether it's to do step 2 or whether to go through an actual risk analysis through expert facilitation. And that will make sure that the risks that are invested in or indeed ignored are the real risks to the success of the organisation, however that's measured. So thank you for signing up, listening, taking part. I just want to acknowledge here that you know, many of the ideas in this presentation are not just mine. So I've written extensively with David Hillson and with Penny Pullen, and again a big thank you to Vanessa for the images. So Holly, I think we can now go out to questions. There's a good 10 minutes to go, so hopefully we can answer quite a few.
Yes, that's correct. So we've had a few come through already, and one of those you touched upon actually when you were discussing risk appetite, but that is, bear with me one moment, as a safety professional, there is a general legal requirement to eliminate risk. How do we square this with the new risk thinking about some risk may be good?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So and maybe I'll just, you know, repeat a little bit, but expand on what I said. And yeah, so when I was at you know, at the ports organisation, that was, you know, absolutely the point, that the senior leadership were committed to people going home safe every day. A huge amount of effort that was put into that, a huge amount of investment for making sure that workplaces were safe, safe for employees, safe for port users, safe for neighbours in the environment. It's a legal requirement. Everybody was really committed to that. But what we needed to do was to make sure that when we were looking at, it's about calibrating the impact scales. Let me start from there. If you think, you know, you'll all use heat maps, probability impact grids to assess risks. It's about the calibration of the scale, because what you need to do is to obviously calibrate the, you know, impact on safety scale using the units that you're using to assess performance against your objective in that, and therefore you know, the things that would be a high impact are really clear, whereas the impact scale for I don't know, earnings or customer satisfaction will be scored very differently. And my experience is that if you get the calibration of your impact scales right, then people naturally start falling into that. So you know, that risks that are you know, a risk that we could, I don't know, increase sales by a certain amount, then by taking a certain action, then, you know, if that's not material, then you're probably not going to put that much effort in to chase it. Whereas, so it's all about sorting out materiality, and you only do that by engaging your senior team through that risk appetite discussion, in my view, those steps that I had on the earlier slide, and making sure that it's really understood. And if it's not understood by your senior managers, sorry, this is a long answer. If it's not understood by your senior managers, then you've not got a chance with then your middle managers and frontline staff to identifying the right risks. So I really would encourage you to think about you know, risk appetite, different appetite for objectives, and calibration of impact scales to make that real. Hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Ruth. And the next question is how best to source benchmark data on organisational risk appetite?
Right, sorry, I said to put my webcam back on, so I've done that now. Right, okay, but I'm not sure you want benchmark data about other organisations' risk appetite so much as you need benchmark data about maybe the sorts of when I was saying about benchmark data, I was really talking about you know, impacts of risks, how big risks have been in certain organisations. I mean, any listed company obviously shares their risk appetite in their annual report, but you know, my experience is that they're just really statements. You know, we've got a high tolerance for risk on this or a low tolerance for risk on that, and that's not really very helpful at all. If you can get your hands on impact scales, calibrated impact scales, that might be quite good, and maybe that's something that through professional bodies like RSM you can get. But I would say that benchmark data is really or you know, getting a perspective on you know, particular risks and how big those impacts would be is really valuable if you can get it. And I would, you know, when I was in my role, in my last role as a head of risk, I guess I did that through my network, you know, through professional bodies. And you can also sign up to some, I mean, obviously some organisations will sell you data. So organisations like Gartner have got quite good benchmark data, but you'd have to buy that.
Okay, and then the next one is, do you explicitly discuss the triple strands with senior leaders when you start facilitating?
I do, yes. But I'm not saying everybody should just rush out and do that, because you've got to be, I would never do that without making sure that they were ready for that discussion. So, you know, I think it's a little bit different for me, because obviously it's work that I'm known for. So often when I'm commissioned as a consultant, I've been hired because people know that you know, my work is a lot around the human aspects of risk management. I think if you've never done it before, you know, one of the ways of getting into it is not so much going in with the triple strand, but going in with examples of, you know, from, you know, behavioural economics or risk psychology. Just, you know, there's lots of common stuff out there. So, you know, some of your senior leaders, you know, might have read, you know, say Daniel Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast and Slow. or might have read predictably irrational, or just I would say, if you've never done it before, find a hook to have a conversation with your teams about influences on human influences on perception of risk. Sometimes you can do it through group biases. Most people have heard of groupthink. That's sort of a nice, safe, understood one to get into, and then you can go from there. But I would say it's really important people know.
Okay, great. And then we've got time just for a couple more questions. So the first is, what kind of effect is the insurance and liability market having on effective risk management?
I'm not an insurance expert, so let me just put that out. Let me put that out for starters. But I've got a couple of points of view. Really interesting that my experience working with groups is that almost whether a risk is insurable is another one of those things that goes into the triple strand. Not another strand, but another perspective. It's another conscious situational assessment, and almost that oh well, if a risk's insurable, well, it's all right then, it's like, it's fine, we'll just buy insurance. I can't really comment on how the insurance industry is helping to promote that, but certainly I've seen that a lot as new forms of insurance come along. So cyber insurance, that sort of thing. Yeah, and of course, how I don't see that many organisations bringing together their risk and insurance data in a logical way. Some do, but I've seen others not. So yeah, I'm not a great insurance expert, and maybe I do have some opinions, but not ones that I want to record about how insurers are driving the market.
Okay, great. And then the final question is, how do you take HSE out of the silo and put it into the business risk model?
Yeah, so that's the $50 million question, isn't it? And in some organisations do it, and the port organisation I worked for did it by saying that all of our risks were assessed using the same financial scale. So what we were able to do then is obviously compare apples with apples. So a risk that would have a safety impact was able to be looked at rationally alongside something that had an earnings impact or a cash impact or an environmental impact. So if you only look at if you have a single scale, then that allows you to look at things much more alongside and equally. But it is difficult, because you do have to get your senior team to have the value of a human life conversation. You do have to agree then how you're going to price risks that would have an impact on safety. So I'm not saying it's a quick fix, but that's one way of getting H&S and out the silo and into another. And I think another one, and it's sort of related to that, is just trying to harmonise policy and procedure and language. So if you look at ISO 31,000, and risk as a neutral concept, and threat and opportunity, and all of that business risk language, and the language in health and safety is sometimes it's different, and for those of us who are risk experts, we can if a safety person says the severity of a risk, then I know what they mean, but I wouldn't use severity in a business context. I'd use exposure. And so I think there's a thing around language and harmonising policy and procedure that is also quite important.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Okay, that's all the time. That's all we have time for today. We have had a few other questions come through at the end, but I'll aim to follow up on those outside of the presentation.
That's fine, and
Ruth,
I'm happy to have input to those.
brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights and experiences with us, and to all as well for joining today. A follow-up email with a link to the recording will be sent later on today, should you wish to recap in your own time. For now, enjoy the rest of your day and goodbye.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Bye bye.